Welcome to the Concast. I'm former dishwasher, failed musician, and absurdist writer John Conrath. On today's show, we talk to writer Joshua Citrak. He's the creator and co-host of the podcast Hangin With Old Lew. Yeah, it looks like you're drinking like that Ecto Cooler stuff.
No, it looks like Metamucil is what it really looks like.
Cool. So, I'm here in the studio, in the Oakland studio for the first time with Joshua Citrak. And thanks for coming out to Oakland and braving the gunfire.
Well, thank you for being here or inviting me to be here. It's really not that bad.
Yeah, it's the day before the Raiders game. I think if you came here tomorrow, you'd have it'd be a little spicier. But we'll see how that goes.
Well, the Raiders suck, so I honestly don't see how people in Oakland can get up for the Raiders anymore when you know that they're leaving. I know that we've had this discussion before, but it honestly is something that truly stumps me. Ever since, when was it, 86 that they moved to L.A.? They came back in 93, 94?
Yeah.
I just don't understand how fans just said, oh, yeah, welcome back.
Yeah. And not only that, but cut a big check for all of their Mount Davis. But yeah, that's, I'm, as much as we joke about it, I'm not a Raiders fan. I try to not publicize that in this neighborhood, but, yeah.
Oh, so you're just a Raiders fan for out of self-defense.
Yeah. I'm like a North Korean Kim Jong-un fan. You know, it's like, yes. Yes, great leader. Yes, we love you. Yes. Even though you're going to, get us all destroyed. Yes, we love you. Yeah, so that's...
What do you think about the theory that North Korea is just a giant conspiracy?
Yeah, I don't know.
That it's just, that they're all actors and it's a puppet state designed to, leverage tensions against superpowers and distract us from some other nefarious Rothschildian.
So they're like a pro wrestling heel, is what you're saying.
Exactly, it is pro wrestling.
Yeah. Well, there is that theory, I guess. I mean, I could talk about Korea for a while as a former employee of the large Korean corporation. But yeah, it's
Hyundai?
No, bigger. There's only 4. Only one that makes tons of phones in the US, but North Korea. I think it's just the bogeyman.
Well, the scary part about North Korea is how it doesn't matter the missiles. And this is kind of the conspiracy to me, is that it doesn't matter about the missiles because they have enough mortars pointed at Seoul to level it. Who cares that they have intercontinental ballistic missiles? That's like icing on the cake. Yeah, it's a big deal, but they already hold a ton of leverage.
Well, my theory on that, and I'm kind of a bit of an amateur historian as far as nuclear stuff goes. I think some of my books are right there where your drink is. Well, maybe the one up. No, you can leave it there. That's fine.
Super Flat Times is a great book.
Oh yeah.
Meatsicles.
Yeah. But the whole nuclear thing anyway is just the countries don't build nuclear weapons because they want to destroy other countries. They do it because they want to get to the big boys table. They want to get up from the kids table. And North Korea is in the situation that they could do anything with their nuclear weapons and start World War III. They could, light one off in far North Korea and say, you guys did it. And it's such a powder keg. It's like playing with fireworks in Southern California right now, which, don't do.
No. No, did you hear that? That's how that the fire in Portland got started.
Oregon,
in the Columbia Gorge was that kids were tossing smoke bombs into the gorge. Yeah,
that's beautiful. And my allergies love all that. The Gilroy fire is just getting sucked right up here. So anyway, So doom, gloom. Oh, we got to, maybe we could throw in some hurricane action.
Yeah. We're actually recording this podcast, before the Hurricane Irma lands. And my family, for inexplicable reasons, we didn't grow up there, but my family all lives within the path of the hurricane.
Oh, no shit.
And my sister, my youngest sister, and her family decided not to evacuate, and they are dead in the eye in Florida.
Are they like on the Sarasota side or on
They're in Tampa.
Yeah, well,
So
that's, yeah. Yeah, I think it might go a little further south than that, but yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, according to what I've seen, I mean the fucking thing is as big as Texas.
Yeah.
And
it's fast.
And it's fast, and
the water is warm, which makes it worse. It hits Lake Okeechobee. That's just like a big old power up for it to run across.
Yeah, and then Lake Okeechobee full of like toxic pollutants from all the sugarcane industry. Here, have some of that too. Because now we've got a hurricane jacked up. It's like the Toxic Avenger.
Yeah, and all me and John have talked about this a lot, but yeah, all the phosphate minings in central Florida, and then you've got MacDill Air Force Base runs all their bombing missions, the practice missions out there.
Yeah. And all the NASA, the rocket fuel and all that's there as well, what do they put in the water and in the air?
Yeah, so that's going to be wonderful. So we're going to talk about podcasting a little bit later, but because you're from the co-creator or creator of the Hangin With Old Lew podcast, no G. And we'll get into that in a little bit. But I wanted to go back a little bit. We talked about your families in Florida, but originally, we both have the Elkhart, Indiana connection.
Yes.
From way back. And I was actually, did I show you the yearbooks from the Kemp thing?
You did.
Okay.
So as some of your listeners may know, shameless plug for, I think it was episode 21 or 22, your first appearance on our show, or was it the second? At any rate.
Well, both.
John brought along his high school yearbooks. John went to school with Sean Kemp. And, on our podcast, we talk a lot about sports and stuff like that. And I think we had been talking about Bo Jackson on a previous episode. And so, yes, I have seen... It's interesting to go back and look at high school yearbooks, but I imagine for you, it's doubly so. I didn't go to a school where anyone is famous, Yeah.
Where did you grow up?
So I grew up in a town called Binghamton, New York. Binghamton, New York was number 3 on the nuke list. Speaking of Armageddon, for Russia, because it was the headquarters of IBM, and that's where they made all their motherboards and semiconductors.
Yeah.
IBM employed my father, employed my grandfather, and many other members of my family. And then, of course, they moved to China, and now Binghamton is just another rust bucket city.
Yeah, and for people who forget, I mean, IBM made more than just the PC or the PC Junior or whatever. I mean, back then...
DOS.
Yeah, back then, though, they were making like all of the hardware and like the space shuttles and the Titan missiles and all of the big launch computers down in Mission Control and in all the missile silos and, just everything. I mean, if you look up the history of IBM, they got their start doing like all of those big targeting computers during World War II or after that, and all the nuke stuff and all the research from the Manhattan Project and all that.
They were, a major player in the military-industrial complex that Eisenhower warned us about, and thus us being number 3 on Russia's nuke list. I think D.C. was 1, and maybe Seattle was 2. I don't know. I'd have to look that up on Wikipedia. But growing up, we lived under the specter, as many people did, of a nuclear holocaust. And I can remember very young age having bomb drills where you crawl under your desk as if that were going to save you.
Do you remember The Day After?
Yes.
That was the big one, and it's also interesting. And I don't
Michael
know.
Ironsides, was he in that movie?
I don't remember. No, it was. I don't. Well, it's too early in the morning. I'm sure I'll remember it later. But I'll just put a link in. Go find it. But it was interesting to me because you come from a slightly religious background,
No, extremely religious background.
Pentecostal.
Speaking in tongues.
Yeah, and that was because your mom was originally from Elkhart, which Elkhart is a big hotbed for, Pentecostal and all of the and also Mennonite and Amish, but that's like a completely different side of the spectrum. But there was a lot of that, and I remember when I was a kid. I mean, you had the nuclear Holocaust stuff going on The Day After, and that all of those movies and even stuff like Red Dawn, and the Russians are going to kill some. But there was also like that thin crossover that I knew people that were Pentecostals and stuff that was like intertwined with like revelations.
For sure.
Like the apocalypse was going to start with Russia launching all those nukes. And when I was a kid, I was Catholic, which, now is like Catholic is pretty far right, conservative, whatever. I mean, they're loosening up and everything.
Pope Francis.
But back then, like to some of the Pentecostals and stuff, being Catholic was like being a Satanist. I mean,
for sure, yeah.
And so, like, I mean, I remember in like the 3rd or 4th grade, like some kid who was a friend of mine coming up to me and saying, "You know what? You're going to hell."
I was probably that kid. Sorry, John.
Yeah, I mean, it was so like you had that specter of death hanging over you, and then you had all the nuke stuff was just kind of wrapped around in it.
Yeah,
and Elkhart wasn't. I don't think we were the 3rd or 4th or 5th on the list, but I mean we had Grissom Air Force Base was 100 miles down the road, and then Chicago was 100 miles over. So we were. I mean, we were all fucked anyway. But luckily, all that went away, and that's not going to happen in the future, and we won't talk about that. But
well, yeah, I was going back to the Pentecostal thing. It's like. I was balls deep. If that was like a thing to be balls deep in Jesus, then that's what I was, like you said, Elkhart, that's where my great aunt and uncle live. My family on my mom's side, my mom raised me as a single parent, is from Cleveland. And so her father was a psychiatrist who believed in gay conversion therapy. Nice. And when I moved to San Francisco, he would send me these tapes to give to my gay friends because he was convinced. Speaking of apocalypses, he was convinced that San Francisco was Sodom and Gomorrah, and that whether it be a nuclear weapon or whatever was going to be wiped off. His theory was an earthquake, that God was just going to smite us. Like fuck that. And so yeah.
We can't have an earthquake yet until the Giants can get back in the World Series.
That could be quite a while, which we're safe. We're safe for quite a while.
So, side note, I was actually writing about this the other day, but was it the 2003 World Series that was the Angels versus the Giants?
That was 2002.
Yeah. So I had this conspiracy theory.
The famous, not to cut you off, John, I'm sorry.
It's okay.
That Dusty Baker comes out and gives the game ball to Le'Veon Hernandez.
Yeah.
Which in Game 6, which blows the series for us. You know?
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah, but
Dusty.
I had this big conspiracy theory that the last time 2 California teams faced each other in the World Series was 1989. Which was the earthquake.
The Bay Bridge
the big
series.
Earthquake. And so I was in Vegas the week of the World Series, and I was convinced there was going to be another earthquake. I was like, this is going to happen. This is like, it's like a numerology. So I was actually on the Strip going from sportsbook to sportsbook, seeing if somebody would take action on this. And I was like, what are the odds there's going to be an earthquake? I want to put $20 on it. And then retire.
What was there?
No, nobody would take.
Wow, it's amazing like how conservative we were not just 25 years ago. Now, whenever there's a big game or whatever, there's huge bets on like whether someone's going to blow out his knee or, all these crazy things. But back then, that would seem like a logical bet.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, I did not get that, and there was no earthquake, so that's good.
You'd only be down $20, so.
Yeah. So, so you grew up in that's like the kind of the Albany-ish area, or
No, it's
or what New York City dwellers would call upstate. I mean,
it's definitely upstate for sure. But New Yorkers, a lot like San Franciscans, I'm a San Franciscan, is that they're extremely snobby. And so anyone who falls outside this arbitrary piece of dirt is scumbag upstaters. And that's what we were. Binghamton is on the Pennsylvania border. We used to dip across state lines and buy fireworks.
Oh, yeah, okay.
So Scranton, Wilkes-Barre, real close by. Syracuse is about an hour away. Back in the day, Binghamton was a really happening place. Like we had kind of touched on, IBM employed quite a number of people there, but that's not the case anymore. It's mostly an empty town with a huge toxic plume floating into the Susquehanna River. It's actually a Superfund site.
Yeah, that's because when did you graduate high school?
93.
So yeah, you were probably in the depths of. I mean, that was pretty much where the cliff was,
Yep.
right around then.
Yep. In 95 was when IBM started moving to China.
Yeah.
And they moved some to San Jose. My dad had talked about relocating to San Jose, but they ended up firing him. He had been with the company for 27 years. He had started when he was 17.
Wow.
And so he was about a year away from full retirement. So they fucked him, basically.
Yeah, yeah, and it's weird to even think now that stuff was made in the U.S.
Stuff like that, yeah, for sure.
Not to get all red hat, yeah, I mean, even here, I mean, like the original Atari 2600s were made just down the road, and in I think it was in Sunnyvale or
Sunnyvale, yeah,
and they just used to have these big factories, or even like, do you remember all those little handheld computer football games that they used to have in the early 80s? Like Mattel had one, but there was a company, I think it was VTech. I think now they make those kid leap pad things for those
Leapfrog,
quote unquote educational games. But back in the mid 80s, they had all of those different games. Like they would do like licensed kind of rip-offs of, like Dig Dug or something with just like a really shitty version with LCD. But they were in Inglewood, and like they had like thousands of people, which is just now you think about, you listen to an NWA album or something, and you're like, holy shit, that used to be like a tech giant capital. And unbeknownst to people at the time, all of those, like making silicon and making circuit boards and stuff like that is like extremely hazardous, dangerous stuff. And they just back then they just used to dump that shit in the water plume.
Yep.
And then they were like, fuck you, we're leaving. And
and that's exactly what happened in Binghamton to IBM, is that IBM for decades upon decades was dumping the toxic chemicals just right into the ground. I played Little League on a baseball field that my grandfather later told me, oh yeah, I used to just roll the barrels out there and dump them in, just turn them over and let them run out. They put a foot of topsoil, IBM did, and a layer of sod on there, put a backstop, and that was where I played Little League. I grew up with kids who never grew out of adolescence because they died of horrific cancers.
Yeah.
And like I said, it is now a Superfund site. But, about the manufacturing thing, we keep on getting back to this doom and gloom, but, we used to make all these things, and yes, the toxicity of it, of course, is horrific. But now, what does America make? What are we known for manufacturing? Weapons.
Yeah.
That's the only thing that we still keep in-house. Everything else is outsourced. Our cars are made in Canada or in Mexico. Our electronics are made in China.
And some of that is, there's good reason for it. I mean, I think about Well, I mean, Elkhart still is a manufacturing capital of, now it's all RVs. It's really, they put all their eggs in one basket on the one
That'll
thing
work
that
out.
that fluctuates luxury purchases based on gas prices.
For sure.
And right now they're making money hand over fist and they can't hire people fast enough. But I mean, I remember one was like there were those heavy recessions in the 80, 81, 82. And there were two recessions like in 80 and then one in like 82, I think. And like Elkhart never recovered from the 81 before the 82 one started. And I mean, it was just people just, every sign, every corner had a will work for food sign, and every, 60-year-old guys working at McDonald's because they're trying, the mortgage is just so underwater and they got 3 kids. And it's Elkhart has multiple Superfund sites for a city of 40,000. And I mean, my connection to that is I had an uncle that died of brain cancer, and the family conspiracy is because Conrail, the train, they used to have their biggest station, or not station, switch yard or whatever they call it, categorization yard or something like that. They used to have this big station. They still have it, and they used to wash the trains with toxic shit and let it run into the groundwater. And he lived like a half a mile from that station.
God.
And it was also Conrail in the 90s. Eventually, there was a big $1 billion lawsuit, and they had to pay to put everybody on city water. And then the city water became a Superfund site,
of course,
separate thing. But from what I remember, because I graduated in 89 and I kind of came back and forth a lot before I left Indiana in 95. And I remember that cliff, and I remember the just the sucking sound of all those.
For sure.
And just like this just like post-apocalyptic leftovers of just like crumbling infrastructure and these old
For sure.
brick buildings covered in soot and vacant.
Rows and rows of vacant buildings, streets and whatnot. We talked, I graduated in 93 and I'd come back to visit, a couple times like you had said. And one time on my visit, the headline of the Binghamton paper, the Presence and Bolton, was 95% of high school graduates leave within the first year of graduating the Binghamton area. And, as I'm sure is the case with Elkhart, that's a huge talent suck.
Yeah. I mean, Elkhart didn't have that problem because nobody went to college. That's not entirely true. I mean, but Indiana as a whole has that problem. And not to, we're on a huge political sidetrack here, but I mean, this is still going on with Indiana, and of course, because of recent events that I don't want to talk about him, but it's become even more in the forefront. But yeah, and Elkhart's big thing now was they operate this gigantic landfill south of town, that it's just like, come on in and dump your shit. And, for all over northern Indiana, like, your town won't take your stuff. Just bring it on out. This is our new industry. And anyway, this landfill, this giant, 1,000-acre landfill, caught on fire either earlier this year or last year. And like, they could not put it out. And like, the whole city was it smelled like just burning garbage. And because it happened during storms and like the wind was just whipping all this burning garbage, and the fire department couldn't do anything. Like, it was one of those like super fires. It's like one of those, like, there's some coal mine in Pennsylvania that caught on fire in like 1967 and it's still burning because like it burns off the coal, and then the gases get trapped in the thing, and the gases are flammable, so they go back in, and it was just burning for like weeks before they could get it. And that was, burning garbage fire, perfect metaphor.
That whole area, like I said, my family was in Cleveland. Big thing in Cleveland, the Cuyahoga River caught on fire in the 1970s, and the fire just floated downstream with the tide, with the current.
Yeah.
And it's kind of amazing, John, that at this day and age that we, and I mean not us, these dumb shits and Elkhart are still participating in things that we already know are harmful to us, right?
Yeah, well,
We've outsourced, like we said, we'd outsourced all these dangerous shit of building circuit boards and microchips and whatnot to places where they don't care about that, or they care less about the health of the people there than manufacturing the shit and shipping it to us.
well, they care more about the profit angle.
Of course.
I mean, it's like
Yes.
it's like the Fight Club recall, financial scene of like, if it's less than X people, we don't do the recall, and it's the same of, if it damages so many people, we don't make it safer. And I think some companies, as much as Apple has a bad rap with the suicide nets on their factories and all that.
Foxconn, yeah.
Foxconn. One of the interesting things that Tim Cook did recently, and Tim Cook is an interesting CEO because he came from the manufacturing side, and his whole thing is like he's just a bean counter and he's just into like material science and stuff like that. But he just did this pledge of like by, I forget when, 2025 or something insane like that, we are going to make all Apple stuff out of post-consumer waste.
Huh.
And, we're not going to be mining the heavy metals anymore. We're not going to be, sourcing this harmful plastic, CPVC plastic or whatever from, oils and toxic chemicals. We're just going to make everything from recycled stuff. And we have no idea how. But this is like our moonshot thing. And, and for Apple, okay, they make so much profit and their stuff is so expensive that, they can probably figure it out a little more than, some of the Chinese companies pumping out phones. And they're in the early steps of this. Like Apple has a recycling program for their phones,
Sure.
and they take a lot of trade-ins, and they do that kind of stuff. But it's interesting that they're doing it, but of course nobody else is.
Well, I wonder, you said Tim Cook is kind of a bean counter. I kind of wonder if that's where the root of his decision is that, how it's like it's more cost effective to recycle aluminum than it is to mine it.
Yeah.
It's probably the same thing with a lot of these heavy metals. And the more that we mine, there's a very finite amount of some of the, the higher you go up on the periodic table, the less, volume there is on the Earth. And
yeah, we're going to run out of helium soon. Right.
And so it might just make sense. It's like, well, we've already mined it and the shit is just lying around in piles, Everybody's seen the pictures of the little kid burning off the rubber on a wire to, get the lead or copper or whatever, in some faraway third world country. And, the cynic inside of me is like, well, it's because they know that it's more cost effective now because they already mined this to recycle it.
Yeah.
Rather than to go and dig out more in some godforsaken country, refine that in some other godforsaken country. And,
Yeah, and not only the cost of labor, but like the political cost or whatever.
For sure, yeah.
Going into getting conflict metals from a war-torn country, and
right?
Wherever.
Like you said, Apple has a brand to protect, a brand that a lot of, and I'm using air quotes, liberal people, hardcore fans of Apple. They have a very powerful brand that they need to protect from stuff. They're not like Microsoft,
Yeah.
Where Microsoft has a completely different brand and a completely different way of making a profit,
Yeah. So, when you were in this post-apocalyptic nightmare, how did you get out of there?
Sure. Well, so just to take it one step or two steps back. So we had said that I'd grown up very Christian, and I kind of had an epiphany when I was about 13 that none of this stuff in the Bible really made a whole lot of sense, and it's not like I'm some fucking smart guy or whatever. All you have to do is read the Bible with the modicum of critical eye to see that none of this shit makes sense, and it's actually kind of shitty, And I started asking questions, and it was a typical story of someone who's just like becomes disillusioned with their faith. And so in doing that, oftentimes the pendulum swings hard the other way. I became kind of just like a fuck up, you know. I was using drugs. I was doing a lot of the things that I had been raised to not do. I wanted to do all of those things, we'll just say. And so I was kind of aimless, you know. By the time I had graduated, all my friends went off to college. My parents were, for reasons that is too deep to get into. My parents were not supportive of me going to college. And this was before Clinton signed in the College Loan Act. So a couple, maybe 2 or 3 years before that. So back then you didn't really have a way to go to college if you didn't have money.
Yeah.
You know? So I went to the community college. I worked at a steakhouse as a prep cook and a dishwasher. I fucked all the waitresses and, smoked weed and, took acid and whatnot. And it's really kind of like a meaningless existence. And just so happened that some older friends of mine had graduated from college. They went to Syracuse and they had moved out to San Francisco and they had a room in their house. And they're like, hey, we have an open room in your house. The rent is, can't even remember what it was, $200 maybe. And so I said, okay. I took a Greyhound. I flew to Chicago, hung out with a friend of mine, took a Greyhound from there, and I've been here ever since. And, it's actually one of the luckiest, most blessed things that I've done. I mean, I did it to get away from my parents, all the typical things that you do to go and have adventures and whatnot. But it turns out, I'm here now, and it's, I've lived a pretty blessed existence, based off of that, because I turn and none of my siblings left, my cousins, they're all there and they're all struggling, and it's just a grind, and it's just like, I just look at it, I'm like, man, and like I said, I'm not some super smart guy, part of my luck is being here where things are happening.
Yeah. And your timing was so when did you come out here? Like 95?
94.
94.
The late part of 94. I was 19.
So that was like right before it all exploded.
Yep.
I mean, the first wave. Well, not the first wave. I mean, it's like the 17th wave. But,
for sure.
But what I think of as the first wave, because I
in the modern era, we'll say.
Yeah, the first internet wave.
Yeah,
we'll say that. So when did you start writing then? So how did you get into that?
Right. So I started writing when I was about. This is going to sound really haughty, but when I was about 8 or 9 years old, and I would write. I had this. It wasn't even a journal or a diary. It was like some old It was like a book that you would sign into a wedding registry or a hotel. It's like gilded pages. Yeah, exactly. And it had lines, and it was colored. And I didn't grow up in an intellectual house. The only book we had probably was the Bible and Billy Graham's autobiography.
Yeah.
And I grew up went to public school where it was totally not challenging. I was the prototypical underachiever throughout my whole life. But I would write little stories and, about my classmates, girls that I liked, whatever. When you're growing up, there's a lot of confusing things. And if your parents don't tell you about it, you feel really weird. You feel awkward. Why am I having all these feelings? So I would just write it out, just like we do now when we write. We write out what's going on in our minds. So, and not to sound self-indulgent about saying that I'm 8 years old, but one day I came home from school and my stepfather and my mother were in my room, and I could tell that they were fucking furious. And then my stepfather showed me my book. What is this? This is filth. This is garbage. And I got the shit kicked out. I got the shit kicked out of me all the time. But, and I remember as I was crying and kind of winding down from the ass kicking I just took, wow, those were just words that I wrote down.
Yeah.
How powerful of a reaction did I just get? And so that had always stuck with me as something that, when I started writing seriously, when I was, in my early 20s, I went through my Bukowski phase, like most young men do, who pretend to be writers.
Take a look right there.
Yep, I see. There's an entire shelf with the tannish, flesh-colored beige black Sparrow press covers of Bukowski in the studio. But I think it was that moment that elicited the words are so powerful, and words can really communicate beyond, the carefully written word can really trigger a lot of things in people, I guess is what I'm saying. So,
yeah. And it's interesting to think about, cause I had the same, not the same situation with getting my ass kicked and all that, but the same feeling of, once your parents tell you like, this is wrong, you can't do this. And you're in that certain post-epiphany phase where it's like, no, fuck you. This is what I am. I'm dedicating my life to this. But,
for sure.
Of just everything from, like, for me, it was heavy metal. I'm sure for you, it was rap or hip hop or whatever.
Yeah. Well, that had a lot to do with that as well. Yep.
Yeah. But, and also, I mean, I was, this wasn't like laid out for me or enforced, but I mean, the kind of the pattern was, you're going to go to school for 4 years and come back and get a job at a local bank or something and get married and buy the house across the street from us and, just kind of do that whole thing. And yeah, so for me, it was the same kind of like, I got to get the fuck out of here. And, and I was so lucky to get to Seattle in 95, also the beginning of that first big wave of internet stuff. And even back then, I used to come down to San Francisco in the mid 90s for trade shows and stuff like that. And it was so different than it is now. And I mean, that's the whole, like, back in my day, but just that feeling of, before that gold rush really kicked in, like it was cheap to live here still. Yep. It wasn't as crowded. I mean, compared to being in Indiana, it's like, oh my God, this is overload. But thinking back on it, it wasn't that bad. And also back then, like, I mean, there were like cab drivers that were just like learning HTML and like thinking, okay, I'm going to go, just get into that, or, retired school teachers getting into software development. And,
it was another gold rush, for San Francisco, for sure. But, you're right that San Francisco back then had a really small town feel still. Yeah. I quickly fell into a group of people who were born and raised here. My co-host on Hangin With Old Lew being one of them. And we always used to joke that it was Cowtown. Things in San Francisco shut down at 10 p.m., on a Saturday.
Yeah.
Where now we're kind of like, Manhattan light, esque, where you can get anything you want. You can get fucking weed delivered at 2 a.m.,
Yeah.
But I wonder,
Get
John.
Nug code name.
Yes, that's a we're a Get Nug ambassador. Anyway, John, I wonder, because we're talking about writing, and we both kind of grew up in these manufacturing towns of post-apocalyptic places. Your writing has a lot of that kind of influence. Is that where that all stemmed from with you?
Sure. I mean, it's for me, I started at Bukowski too, and all the other predictable, Kerouac and Burroughs, which I'm waving at shelves here, but all the Henry Miller stuff, all the Burroughs stuff. I've got way too many books in this room, but I got started with that stuff, and I think Burroughs was like that post-apocalyptic. Master, and just seeing how he distorted reality at a time when you think of the 50s as being like this honest, clean, the guys working, the moms at home, the leave it to beaver kind of
Yep.
existence. But then you look at what Kerouac was. I mean, Kerouac's writing about smoking weed and going across the country on kicks and just fucking everything that moves and all that.
Yeah.
And Burroughs is writing about, I mean, people forget, like, people thought Truman was just as bad as, who. I mean, Truman dropped nuclear bombs on Japan. And
Yep.
we, back then, it's like, we're going to get in this war. And I mean, all of that stuff started in the 50s. And Burroughs was just, Burroughs was on heroin and he thought he saw nuclear war happening as he was going on. But I mean, you look at like something like Naked Lunch and read it. And
Yeah.
I mean, this is not Leave It to Beaver. And,
No.
and the way that he was able to transform that weirdness into fiction was just had a big heart on for that stuff. And, going into that now, I mean, my hardest thing now is I write about this absurd stuff and 6 months later it happens. And, I mean, just everything I was writing about in 2012 is like, it's old news at this point. And so it's a little scary to try to keep ahead of that curve, but also think like, okay, well, we're going to have a presidential candidate bring a severed head on stage in 2020. And, that's, I mean, or whatever. I mean, it's a little weird. So who, aside from Bukowski, I mean, who are your guys going forward from there, or gals?
Sure. I recently sold all my Bukowski books. I hadn't picked them up in quite a while. And the guy at Green Apple Bookstore is a place in San Francisco out in the Sunset, or the Richmond, excuse me, that is just a great old place, just musty, full of books. And the guy was like, just like visibly panting when he saw the box that I brought him in. I brought him Fonte and Bukowski and a bunch of others. And he's like, "Do you have more of this? I can't keep this on the shelves." So yeah, I mean, the usual suspects, all the same guys that you saw or that you spoke about. But I also kind of I got really into poetry.
Yeah.
I think that had I been exposed to it, I would have been a poet. I prefer poetry. Poetry of all kinds, but especially like European poetry of like the late 19th century. Fernando Pessoa is a huge influence on my life, and I think that's why you kind of casually referenced my love of hip hop. I think that's why I love hip hop is just. There was a certain time in hip hop. We're not this mumble rapper shit that we're talking about now.
Yeah.
But that hip hop was full of like a poetry, a real poetry. So things like that. I mean, we've got Dennis Johnson's book "Jesus' Son" in front of us. That was a huge influence. I read that every night before I went to sleep for probably 10 years.
Yeah. A callback to stripping wiring out of walls.
Oh, for sure, Yeah, so those guys were people that I found hugely influential, but there are also a lot of local people. When I moved here, I kind of fell into a group of writers, and they're kind of alternative writers. One of these guys. He goes by the pen name of Scott James. He wrote the book Soma, which was a book about that time that I moved here. So as the bubble was kind of cresting, it was about Craigslist and how you meet in fucks, how you could hook up with people, both gay and straight, and all the fetishes that went along with San Francisco as it kind of really started to fly its freak flag, which I was, balls deep in, again, not as balls deep in as I was with Jesus, but, definitely touching the tip of my scrotum. So, but yeah, as I've gotten older though, I've found that it's become harder and harder for me to read fiction.
Yeah, it's It's interesting. I guess the poetry versus fiction argument is going on, and I, like you, I was not exposed to poetry very much at all in high school, or I think in college I took like one class that was like half and half. So I've never really written much poetry, and I think Bukowski is kind of the intro to that,
For sure. Yeah.
which is like serious poetry people are just like, oh shit, yeah, it's fiction's tough now, and on both sides, because there's the genreification of commercial fiction is pushing on one side, and then there's almost like a death of literary fiction on the other side.
There's no market for it.
There's no market, and it's also become so commoditized out of MFA programs and stuff that it's
Which you once accused me of being, I'll say.
well, we mentioned MFA style stories one time, but yeah, it's
I didn't take offense. I know what you meant.
But that's a template, and we're at a point now where it's been done enough that it's kind of like, well,
Wasn't Dennis Johnson in Iowa Writers Workshop?
yeah, and all of his disciples are kind of follow that, but it's at a point where you have to move past that, or do you? But so I wanted to talk about you worked with a group of people in kind of I don't know if you call it a collective or a workspace or something called the Grotto. How did you fall into that?
Well, so as we had just touched on in the what we were talking about, Scott James, who is the actual guy of Kimball Scott, who's now gone. He's actually, interesting story about him is that he was a 2-time Emmy Award winning journalist back in Rhode Island. His big claim to fame was the Great White fireworks tragedy in which nightclub burned down. He did all the investigative reporting. He won 2 Emmys for it. He's actually writing a book on it now. Shout out. So he moved out here to do freelance journalism and whatnot, and to write fiction, to write gay-centric fiction, which wasn't really a mainstream thing at this point. When his book came out, probably one of the first to have gay, straight, bisexual, fetishized characters. And he ran a small literary magazine. I think it was called Soma Literary Review. And at this time, I was writing shit stories, just stories about my own life, probably another a publisher that I got to know in later years. His wife once told me that she said, we call them blood, guts, and booze stories.
Yeah.
And that was the kind of shit that I was writing. But I was starting to branch out into other things, and he had kind of given me my first shot, was like, hey, I'll publish some of your stuff. And he gave me confidence. And then as the years went by, he kind of took me under his wing and was a huge mentor, and still is to this day.
Yeah.
We're now a part of the Castro Writers Co-op, which is on Castro Street. We have our offices there. And the group itself was hugely influential. That's when I really started to be a writer.
Yeah.
So it wasn't just Scott, but we had poets, we had YA authors, we had screenwriters, the gamut, nonfiction. The people that I met there, I met Jeff Kirshner, who's the guy who went on to found Literati. He's a writer who has this amazing story. Tons and tons of people, best-selling authors, and so
that's kind of where we met in person, was one of your readings from that. I mean, we'd known each other for years, but
exactly.
One bar in what was that, 2010 or 12 or something?
Yeah, it's got a big neon palm tree in front of it, and those glass bricks.
All I remember, it was the day that Brian Wilson blew out his ACL at Coors Field for the second time, and pretty much his downfall. But yeah.
So yeah, so that's when I started to become a writer. And as with anything in life, confidence plays a huge role in it. And when you become part of a group of these talented people, when these people start seeing you as their peer, their peer, it gives you a lot of confidence. And so that's kind of when I would say that I started to become a writer. I started to regularly publish, etc.
So just to throw out a couple of names that, at you here that I was curious about, a few of our other connections. Mike Daly,
Oh yeah.
who originally got you hooked into my stuff with Aaron the Paragraph Line.
Yep.
Where did you know him, or
So that's a great name to bring up to me, because Mike Daly is actually where, and it wasn't just him, but since we're talking about him, is where I started podcasting. So this was back in like 2005 or 6, maybe. I had moved up to Portland. I was finishing my degree at Portland State, and I knew Kevin Samsel. I don't know if you know who he is. His books are incredible. If check them out. He's got written a memoir that's just so unbelievably touching, and he has some of the greatest titles for his books. One of his books is called Creamy Bullets. But he's just a fantastic writer, and he's kind of like the kingpin of the underground indie press scene in Portland. He works at Powell's. He heads the indie book department. So I met him. I sent him my a manuscript that I had written, and which he called "Oh, you mean kind of like Party of Five," which I was very hurt by that, but whatever. It kind of was. That's what I was into.
Yeah.
So he hooked me up with a lot of other writers there in Portland, and Mike Daly was doing this kind of experimental thing. He had a bass guitarist and a drum machine and some other percussion instruments, and he would kind of, in the form of like a rap or a poetry slam, read out his poetry. And I was like, I just happened to be at this coffee house in Portland, and Mike went on stage, and I was like, God damn. And I was like, can I start recording this like now? And he's like, sure. And so I went home, recorded it. I just started my magazine, Slouch Mag, and I didn't know what to do with it. It's just another like shitty online literary journal, which it still is. And so I started putting out, I would go to readings around Portland and record them, if the author would let me. Or else I would say, hey, if you've got a recording, send it to me. I'll put it online.
Yeah.
And so that was kind of like the first iteration of podcasting for me. And Mike was hugely important to me in opening up a lot of doors, including, he's the reason probably why we're here right now, in a historical sense, at least. So.
And another name to throw at you before we get too into the podcasting stuff is Jeffrey Dinsmore.
Dinsmore, yes. Dinsmore is he's one of my favorite people alive. I can't say enough good things about him and his heart. He really feels things deeply, and he just has such a good soul and such a kind soul. He published me in one or two of his anthologies. I think it was Contemporary Press, and then it was Awkward Press.
Yeah.
And we actually did an event together. I flew down to LA and met him in person, and he's just a super great dude. And it's funny because when Jeffrey Lewis, who's my co-host on Hangin With Old Lew, when we started our podcast, Jeff Dinsmore was a huge help in getting us started and pointing us in the right direction. So it's his fault, motherfuckers. If you don't like our podcast, blame Jeffrey Dinsmore. So yeah.
Yeah, he's an interesting dude. He's I briefly lived in LA, and I met up with him once, and this was in '08, And I think at that time, it was like right on the precipice of all of that stuff. And I think I was trying to figure out what to do next with Air in a Paragraph line, and we were just trying to kind of scheme for a little bit on that. But I've kept up with him since, and he did one of the things that he started to do that I was very jealous of, but I also loved, and unfortunately he wasn't able to finish it. But was one of the years, I forget when, 2010, 11, he was trying to publish a story a day online.
Yes.
Do you remember this? And it weren't necessarily stories. It was a kind of flash or essays or
100
whatever.
Words, 150 words. Yeah.
And he was like really just kind of scraping the barrel. I mean, there was a lot of stuff, but I mean, it was like memoir stuff and all that. And it was awesome. And I just remember the time, like by about February, I was like, God damn it, I got to do this next year. I got to start doing it. And I think he only got up to like April or something, and then he broke his arm.
Okay. Yeah.
If you remember that. And then he stopped, but just unfortunate. But I was like, I think every year at like December 30th, I think, okay, what am I going to do this? How am I going to, I'm going to take a manuscript and split it into 365 pieces and tweet it out or do something. But
have you heard that or have you been following the Twitter horror story? My wife keeps telling me about it. She's like, "Oh my God, it's so good."
No, I've heard about some of those projects, and I honestly, I have a Twitter, and I CC stuff through Buffer or through Libsyn, posts stuff out there. But I'm honestly kind of boycotting Twitter.
What's your social media platform of choice?
Facebook.
Facebook, really?
Yeah, it's well, I can go either way on it. I mean, honestly, I've had this blog. It's at rumor.com, and I just hit 20 years with it.
Wow.
And that is really my core of, because no matter what happens, I still have that.
You control that,
if Facebook goes tits up or subscribe, fee only or whatever.
They ban you.
Or they ban me, or, Twitter gets, shut down by the government or whatever happens. I still have everything on Rumored. And, it's in WordPress now, but I could dump it out and put it somewhere else.
Sure.
So that's like the core of where my stuff is. But yeah, I'm always on Facebook shit posting.
The thing that I find about Facebook is that it just gets too insane. And I was listening to this podcast, the Sam Harris podcast, and the guest was Tristam Harris, who's like, he's an ex-Google employee, and he's kind of like a philosopher slash sociologist about like the ethics of persuasion of what we're doing in online, in the economy, the attention economy. And, kind of the things that Facebook does to tweak your outrage and to encourage the feedback loop. And I see this with the people that I'm friends with. These are people that I respect. I've seen people call for killing people. Like, this is on Facebook, dipshit. Your employer is going to see this.
Yeah.
In this this outrageous sense, especially with the political climate that we're in right now. It's just like the overwhelming feedback loop is just like insane, and it just gets too overwhelming. And I mean, Facebook is a place where I think that we kind of use it like you use Twitter. It's a place for the show. I wouldn't use it myself as Joshua Citrak. I go on there as the entity, Hangin With Old Lew. Post about our show. We post a podcast recommendation of the week that's not our podcast. Try to add value for our listeners. But beyond that, if something comes up in an article or whatever that we talk about, I'll post it on Facebook and whatnot via Buffer or something. But I just can't deal with Facebook.
Well, my thing is, I can't deal with politics on Facebook.
That's a huge part of it, John.
And I very liberally unfollow a lot of people who are guilty of that. But
the thing is that there's no humor there anymore. It's like you can't post like someone's like, yada, 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 something about politics. And you're like, well, the other side is like someone will put something like, oh, did you see that so-and-so shot the Cecil the Lion? And you're like, that this village got $30,000 for Cecil the Lion, which will pay for their water and their primary school for the next year. Fuck you, you fucking hunter apologist fuck.
Yeah. I mean, it's tough. And now, there's, I guess it's like outrage porn,
Sure.
and is what it is, and it goes both ways. And I just, some people habitually kind of shitpost that stuff, and I mean, for me, Facebook is, aside from trying to sell books, which doesn't work, and trying to promote this podcast, which also doesn't really work.
Yeah, we gave up on that too.
Which is amazing. I mean, I will post something and like 3 people will see it, and unless you pay for, and they're also like, you have a high performing post. Do you want to pay more money so 50,000 people see it? Yeah. And we've done experience with that, both with the podcast and with the publishing stuff. And even when you pay the ransom, it doesn't really work out. Or you get these weird followers from like India or something that are just like, great, you're never going to interact with it. I don't know. But for me, aside from that, Facebook is a performance arts piece. And John Conrath on Facebook is a persona who is not me. And just to break kayfabe on that is I mean, it's, it's just like Hulk Hogan in the ring is not Hulk Hogan. Or, whatever, Andy,
Sure.
Kaufman is not Andy Kaufman. And for me, it's that. And for me, I think I have a lot of fun shit posting memes, photoshopping stupid stuff that makes no sense. Just posting stuff about just fecal incontinence or whatever, and just trying to get a rise out of people with that. And for me, it's a performance art piece that has been ongoing for 5 or 6 years, and it's amazing to see. I mean, the other day I posted some meme about that the Earth is 3 football fields from the sun. Fun fact. And the number of people that replied to that is like, that's not right. And it's like, dude, this is not a peer reviewed journal. This is not.
Well, that gets back to what I'm saying about there's no humor there anymore. It's just like, that's wrong. Fuck you.
Yeah. But I mean, I have friends that do see the humor in it and do appreciate that. And I have, I don't really want to make this public, but I mean, I have a secret group on Facebook that nobody is invited to, and you can't find, and you're in it.
I am in it.
And it has a very...
I blocked you, though. No, just kidding.
Very strict no politics rule. There's just a small group of us. Actually, there's exactly 69 of us that go in there and shit post every day. And if I could make it so Facebook just opened in that group and never showed me anything else, I would pay to get that feature.
John, do you worry about, since you're using your name, do you worry about that? It's a performance art piece. Do you worry about that coming back and biting you in the ass in a professional sense, or is this just like you don't give a fuck? Or
next topic. It's an issue, and it becomes more of an issue when I start thinking I need to change jobs, which
sure.
I'm. I don't want to get into my work situation, but it's fine now. But it's there's definitely that worry. But I mean, I also have that worry with pick up any of my books and open it to a random page, and
for sure,
if you're an outrage warrior, you're gonna
be mad.
out. But
well, maybe in a sense, then but the enormity of your content that you've kind of inoculated yourself against that. This isn't like what's that guy, John Dinsmore or whatever, the Google memo guy, Yeah. It's like, this is who you've been, it's not like maybe you've inoculated yourself against that.
And it's I have a slightly atypical Silicon Valley job that I've been at for a long time. And I think this would be more of a problem if I worked at Google or Facebook or something like that.
Sure.
Because for those, your job is your life. And
right.
Like, for example, somebody I had a weird period at work where we got acquired, and I was like thinking I might have to bug out and stuff. And so I was looking at jobs and stuff. And somebody sent me an Oculus job, their division
Yep.
of Facebook now. You actually have to apply for that job using your Facebook, and they look at your Facebook to see if you are the ideal
Yeah,
Facebook
fuck
employee.
that.
And I was like, yeah, I guess I can't work there, or I'm going to have to start a second Facebook and say, no, this is really me. But
Which they'll know by your timeline. They're like, you just opened it yesterday, you
yeah.
know?
But yeah, if your life is your job and your job is your life, and it's also like Google developer relations people and stuff is like what they're posting as a person is what they're posting as an
For sure.
employee, and
There's little distinction between the two, if any.
and for me, I want a banker's hours kind of leave everything at 5 kind of job, which are still out there. I mean, if you're doing Java EE enterprise development at just some sleepy bank, you can find that. But yeah, so, and there's also kind of the distinction, I think, with this podcast when I started it, because I do get these things of like, I listen to your podcast and you don't even talk about NyQuil. And so yeah, I think this was kind of a shift, and that's my biggest problem with having a persona on Facebook or writing this stuff like that is that I've kind of edged myself in a corner that if I wanted to write memoir or I wanted to write that my own on the road or my own kind of serious, Dennis Johnson type fiction is like, I've got all these people that are like, what the fuck? This doesn't talk about blowing horses, or whatever.
Well, that's funny because I have the same worry that you have with your job, I have about our podcast, my podcast, because while yes, I'm a writer, I've put a lot of things out there. I wouldn't say that I'm a controversial subject. I write a lot of what's now termed, as we were talking about the genreification of fiction. I write a lot of what's termed YA, young adult fiction.
Yeah.
Because I like to write about boys and dads, and that kind of relationship, men to boys and stuff like that, which really interests me. There's a whole psychology there that's very interesting. And, so I think that's pretty harmless, in the fact. But for our podcast, on the other hand, we say and talk about topics that are just insane, that you wouldn't have with your coworkers for sure. But I know that coworkers listen. And sometimes I've been like, fuck, this is it. I'm putting out this podcast. I'm going to walk into a ton of shit with either my friends or, family, people that I know, whomever, strangers. We're going to just get a deluge of shit for this podcast. But
Yeah.
overall, I've found that people are super receptive to the fact that you're actually talking about stuff, that you're not afraid of subjects and whatnot. I mean, we talk a lot about race because I'm white. My co-host is black, or as he would say, colored, which sounds racist to me. He's being self-racist, but whatever. It's his prerogative. And so we talk a lot about race. And, some of the things that we get into, are things that you wouldn't talk about, especially as a white person. Even if you're in a room with all white people, you'd feel weird talking about this stuff.
So just to back up for a minute. So the podcast is Hangin With Old Lew. And I've been over there a couple times, but just to back up, what's the deal with Old Lew? I mean, where did you guys hook up? What's the backstory there before you started the podcast?
Sure. So Jeff and I, his real name is Jeff. He and I became friends. Like I said, I moved to the city in '94, and we met at a place that I was working at. He knew the owner. He would come in and drink, have some food. And him and a guy named Big Mac, Big Mac is a OG, I mean, from Hunters Point, OG hip-hop artist from San Francisco. You can find him on iTunes and all that. He did our theme song for the podcast and our outro music. And so it's kind of like, I describe it to people as like the scene in the Blues Brothers where they go to the soul food cafe that Aretha Franklin's running.
Yeah.
And it's Bones Malone and the Matt Guitar Murphy are in the back, and they're like, she comes in and she's like, there's some crackers out there who want 4 fried chickens and a Coke. And what the other one want? Some dry white toast. And he's like, Jake and Elwood, it's the Blues Brothers. They would come in, and Mac would order a burger that's just cooked the shit out of it. You know, white bread only, no, setup, no tomatoes and onions and lettuce, no mayonnaise, no mustard, no fucking nothing. Just that dead piece of flesh, charred as a motherfucker. And then Jeff would order this more elaborate meal, but it suffice to say that they were very recognizable when they came in. And I would be like, hey, it's Mac and Jeff. It's kind of the Blues Brothers moment. We'd go out there, talk. We'd drink a shot of whiskey or two. And Jeff and I discovered that we lived within a block of each other, 2 blocks. We ended up being at each other's houses all the time. He has got a twin sister whom, to this day, I love pretty much more than anybody else on the planet. We fell in as a group of friends and have been friends for, nearly 20 years.
Yeah.
Or more, I guess.
So how did the podcast start then?
Well, so if you haven't listened to the podcast, Old Lew is the type of guy. So who gets a name like Old Lew, right?
Yeah.
Like he's had this nickname since he was in his early 20s. We call him Old Lew because he was old before his time, Old Lew is a Marine Corps vet. He is a disabled vet. He was hit by friendly fire in Bangladesh. He rescued 2 people. He would say self-depreciatingly that he was just trying to save his own ass and they were in the way. But he saved their lives and he took the brunt. They were hit by mortar fire. Or it was bombs from the Air Force or whatever. And he picked up one guy, threw him out of the way, picked up the other guy, and as he threw him, the bomb hit right behind him, and he hit a tree or something like that.
Yeah.
And so he he's walked with a limp. When we met, he was a very angry guy, but he always had the kind of, he had the ability to just charm the shit out of you, telling the most raunchiest stories. He's just one of those characters. He's just a fucking character. He just has, he has the vernacular down. He could be a stand-up comedian if he put his mind to it. If he quit drinking, he could be a stand-up comedian. And if he had the wherewithal and the drive and didn't have the kids and the mortgage and all that shit. I mean, he's just a storyteller. He's got more stories than there are stars in the sky. And so over the years, we would get together, we'd drink, we'd shit talk, and we just all sit around the table, just all of us friends, it's not just him. And one day, it was more than a year ago, the podcast has been going on for about, I want to say 14 months. We started last May. We were doing our, we get together periodically, as guys do, to bet on meaningless sports things. And this was the March Madness thing. We were all getting together. We were sitting around a table. There's probably 6 of us, 7 of us, drinking liquor and smoking weed and just shit talking. And I was just listening to this, and I had it in my mind already by this point that I wanted to start a podcast. There's a number of podcasters that I was kind of inspired by, and I kind of talked about Dinsmore and the Dad Jeans podcast. And I was just like, this is a podcast. I've never heard a podcast like this where it's just guys talking shit, just straight up shit. There's no politics. I mean, yeah, everything is politics in a sense. There's no structure. There's no format. It's just people shit talking. So I was just like, kind of in a lull of the conversation, I was like, hey guys, I got an idea. What do you guys think about this? And everyone's like, yeah, sounds good. But like a lot of people, as we were just talking about, they don't want to put themselves out there for fear of their job or, friends or family hearing what they really think, right?
Yeah.
And to me, even as wrong or maybe as misguided as some of my thoughts might be, I feel it important to be honest, and I feel important to tell those stories, even if they are uncomfortable to me or if they're uncomfortable to you. And Jeff, being his personality of, I mean, we call it the kind of in the vein of dudism, old Lewism. He just doesn't give a fuck. He doesn't care. And so we're the two that kind of were the driving force behind it. We left it open to everyone, and, Mac helped us kick it off. God bless him for giving us the music and whatnot. And, it's grown from there. And, I mean, it's just been wonderful. And, so on our podcast, we have a lot of guests. We also do it solo, just the two of us, but we've met so many people that, that we would have never met before, and, which is great. And so it's just been a great artistic outlet for the two of us, as we're in kind of the throes of fatherhood and parenting and, the grind of paying bills and taking care of shit like that. So,
yeah. And it's interesting to me. I mean, obviously we're whatever, this will probably be like our 9th or 10th podcast when this goes out. So we're just starting too, but it's something we've talked about for a while. I mean, I started listening to podcasts, 10 years ago or 12 years ago, I think, when they were still on iPods and when they were still clunky as shit and everything like that. But it seems like in the last few years, the momentum has really picked up, and part of it is kind of the conversational quality, or kind of the honesty of, because if you're not scripted, you're going to open up a little more, you're going to have the connection, and you're going to be able to do that and talk to people about stuff. And it's also, for me, for guests, and you maybe you've probably seen this too, is you do get a chance to meet and interact with people more than you would just on Facebook or on, at a reading or something like that.
For sure.
Because you're locked in of like, I got to talk to this person for at least an hour or something like that.
Right. And our podcast goes a little bit further. We also play indie artists, music artists. Not every podcast, but we try to do it as often as we can. And so that also interacts us with another kind of group of people. Most of our artists are not to use the term derogatorily, but SoundCloud rappers, up and coming like pop people. We've had music by like people who have been on American Idol that were kicked off in like the 3rd show and shit like that, know. But it's really great. And that's part of what our goal was for the podcast, was to not only be independent ourselves and, do all the things that's necessary to be independent, but also interact with other independent people and see if we all can't help, kind of cross-pollinate and, lift each other up in ways, expose each other to their audiences and stuff. And, it's been a huge blessing for us. And, it's just been great to interact with all these people, and, and to do it via social media. We use Instagram. That's where our thing is happening. Yeah. But,
Yeah, I haven't really figured out Instagram, but
personally, I love it. I mean, again, I don't use these platforms personally. I use them for the show. I probably wouldn't even be on them if it wasn't for the show. But it's a great way to meet and interact with people who are kind of doing things, I mean, of course there's all the bullshit, and bots and shit like that. But, I just find it a more relaxed medium and a not serious medium, Facebook, it's very serious, this thing is irritating me, sign this petition and whatnot. There's none of that bullshit on Instagram. It's,
Yeah. I mean, Instagram's kind of rating and interaction system, I think, is more laid back.
It's more manipulative too, though.
Yeah, it's definitely it's more positive, I think, than Facebook's. I think
For sure.
Facebook's sharing is, I mean, I think Facebook's sharing of articles is probably how they make the most of their money, but it's also probably the most socially harmful part of the platform.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. It's cynical, and again, it's that feedback loop of people. See this.
Well, it's the whole thing of, I mean, I've wrote about gamification a while back, and it's something that I studied. And I mean, I remember 10 years ago reading a bunch of articles about it. And the gamification of Facebook, I mean, that's what drives it, and that's what's changing our brains, and that's what's, I think,
Well, it's manipulating us in ways that we don't even understand.
yeah, I mean, it's the whole process of you get that little bit of a reward when somebody else shares your article, or when somebody likes it, or when somebody comments on it. It's just that little
A little bit of dopamine.
there's that little drip of heroin into your blood system, and that it makes you want to do more of that, and makes you kind of want to manipulate that, and it just seems like there's less of that on Instagram, or it's just like
It's
a little
definitely
bit,
a narrower focus, but
yeah,
I mean, Instagram does the same thing that Facebook does, and Twitter does as well. Is that I posted. We just did a Instagram post for Hangin With Old Lew, shot a video. Instagram won't tell me when everyone likes it. They'll tell me, oh, 10 people like this, or 20 people watched this. But in reality, 50 people watched it, 100 people liked it. But they'll tell me that over the course of the next few hours. So I keep checking in. Oh,
yeah,
okay, well, now 50 people like it, or whatever. Those people liked it like 3 hours ago. They're just not telling me. And that's the same thing with Facebook. But I mean, it is insidious in that way. But I think ultimately you need to have the wherewithal to realize what they're doing, at least in a very basic sense, and also to disconnect from your phone,
yeah, and just as far as kind of the technology of it or whatever, you guys, have you looked into all this networking of other podcasts, or looking at? I mean, I know podcast movement was a big kind of, I guess it's almost like a trade show now.
Yeah, yeah, it is.
But it seems like, well, this is a separate rant, but I mean, one of my biggest problems with publishing and writing fiction and stuff is that you get sucked into the, I mean, I wish I could just write books and put them on the shelf over here, and that's it. But you get drawn into, okay, you put it on Amazon, you, and then you start checking your sales figures.
Sure.
And then you start wondering, like, well, what if I put some vampires in here? Or what is wrong with it's all this self-validation stuff of, and it's rough. I mean, it's brutal to get into that. It's very bad to put out a book and nobody reads it. You think that people would, and it's just a tsunami. And one of the reasons I wanted to start a podcast was to do something else that wasn't writing or wasn't publishing, rather.
For sure, yeah.
So I started getting into this and recording it, and then I started doing the research, because I'm like, okay, what microphones do I want to buy and stuff like that. And so you get into these Facebook groups or Reddit groups or whatever, and then you realize that it's like kind of the same schemesters of like what is your ROI, and what is your click-through rate, and what are your stats like, and how are you getting advertisers and monetizing, and so I've like kept my distance from that. And part of it too is like, you can go in those groups and you can get ideas, and you could think, oh, I need to buy a mixer, or I need to buy or whatever. And you can get into that trap, but it's also, I could put my podcast out there, but it's like, how many podcasters are listening to podcasts? It's just the same as like the big downfall of marketing writing on Facebook is there's the whole scheme of you're following and adding other writers, and it's like, well, how many books are other writers reading? Because and it's really I get sucked into this, and I don't mean to shit on any of these people or anything like that, but there's a huge, strong network of horror writers, and I don't write horror at all, really. I don't really read it. Nothing against it, but it's just I never really got into it. But I know people from the Bizarro movement who are more like horror / Bizarro writers, and so I'm friends with them, and you get into these runs of like one horror writer will add you and then 10 more and then like 10 because they'll see that writer does it. And I'll see these people that they have hundreds of mutual friends with me, but it's like you're not going to buy my book, I'm not going to buy your book, and it's just like a numbers game of
For sure.
of that. And it's the podcasting thing is I think there's a lot of genuine interest in it from people that aren't other podcasters. And it's easier to listen to a podcast on your way to work than it is to read a novel. But it's also, there is that trap. And,
For sure, and this is one of the things we were talking about. The two of us being podcasters and the influences of other podcasters and turning us into podcasters. It does become kind of a feedback loop, and it is a question of, okay, so how do I go out and get people who, they're not adding me as a friend, like you say. Just to kind of further industry contacts or to fluff up my own stats, who are people who are actually interested in listening to the podcast, et cetera, where's the audience at? Because there is an audience for everything, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
There's an audience, a big audience for everything. And, I can't answer that definitively because we're still a relatively small podcast, although we've grown, and in the ways that we've grown is by doing these things with cross-pollination of other kind of silos, if you will. Like we said, we play music by indie artists. These artists, when they come on, and I'll be totally transparent, this is the reason why we do it, is that, we're going to play some music by, this indie hip-hop artist from the Bay Area, say. And then he tells his circle of friends, his followers, and then, that attracts a few more people outside of the realm of podcasts. Now, the thing about podcasting is that a lot of people don't understand what the fuck it is. It attracts a really narrow band of the populace. It's like basically people who are a little bit older than we are probably don't have any clue what podcasting is. And then you get down into like kids, like early 20s and stuff, probably not listening to podcasts either. Or if they are, they're listening to very targeted, age-specific podcasts. So so that's one of the ways that we do it. We do that not only with musicians, but also other artists. So, I'm wearing a T-shirt of an artist, and or we might, plug some of their work, or if they're showing somewhere, we're really free with our, it's not really advertising, but our shout outs to people, hey, so-and-so is going to be here at this time, go see them. And, hopefully they reciprocate back. A lot of times it doesn't happen, like you said, if you can get, if you can get 10% ROI, then you're doing pretty good, but, that's one of the ways that we're kind of combating that, because that's something that we noticed, within the first few months of podcasting. We're like, okay, so this is the audience, and it was tiny. And we're like, well, okay, so what do we do? All of our friends know, other people who are doing podcasts that helped us or who we know. This isn't going to grow we're not going to grow our audience through our friends. Yeah. Right? Yeah. So now, for the most part, we have no idea who 90% of our audience is, So, yeah. Yeah. So, what do you got going on in the future with the podcast? So we're just booking our fall schedule right now. We're looking to get some. So we do. If you listen to the podcast, we do a couple of different core topics, parenting being one. We also talk a lot about drugs, specifically marijuana. We talk a lot about the legalization industry. I mean, it's an industry that's totally fascinating now in terms of it's kind of the Wild West.
Yeah.
You see ads for fucking marijuana on a bus. If you go into San Francisco, there's a big ad for billboard ad as you come down 80 off the Bay Bridge for Urban Pharma, which is like this dispensary. You've got on the other side, you've got an ad for Corcova, which is like a edibles manufacturer. And so we talk a lot about that. And like the irony, it's like, there's no distinction. Like one of my concerns as a parent and as a stoner, I don't want my fucking kids mistaking a gummy bear. My oldest loves gummy bears. If I go to a dispensary and buy a gummy bear, how the fuck does he know that it's not a gummy bear that he should be eating? I don't know if you've ever eaten a gummy bear from a dispensary. It sends you meet fucking Jesus. So we talk a lot about things like that. We're going to have a chemist on who dabbles in making DMT. We're having so another cannabis related. They're an analyst firm, so we're going to talk about how medical cannabis and recreational cannabis is analyzed and what steps we take to do that. We're looking to get a whole bunch of other guests on. I'm not going to specifically say who, as I haven't set out I haven't done the schedule yet.
Scheduling, I think of everything that I've done with the podcast so far, scheduling is the hardest.
Scheduling is hard. Booking is hard. The worst part is when people don't show up or they tell you 10 minutes before, is that today? And,
that might be because of your subject matter a little bit.
It could be. It could very well be. But the types of people that we bring on the show are people that we know are down with it. And we always say up front, you listen to the show first before you say yes.
Yeah.
Just download the last episode. You don't have to listen to the whole thing. You'll get it within 5 minutes of what the fuck we're talking about, Yeah. They all agree to that in advance. Really excited about what's coming up. I'm on 6 months of parental leave because I have a newborn at home. So my time is a little freer. It's a little stranger too because I'm not interacting with adults on a regular basis. So, but I have a little more free time to kind of really delve in and really take the show to the kind of the next level there as far as guests and music and all that stuff. So
cool. So, I think we hit everything so far here. Just wanted to,
but don't hit women.
Yeah, unless you're in the NFL, then it's fine, I guess. But
I guess so. Yeah, Kaepernick is still unemployed. Huh? That's another thing. You can't get Kaepernick out of the topic there, out of the conversation range, rather.
Yeah, can he play baseball?
He could have been drafted. That was what they said. He could have been drafted if he wanted to.
Well, there you go. Hangin With Old Lew, no G.
Yep.
It's .com.
Yep. Hangin With Old Lew, HANGIN. With Old Lew, LEW, .com. There's links to all the past shows, links to our iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play. You can find us on the web, Facebook, Twitter, Gmail, Hangin With Old Lew, same spelling. We're on Instagram at Hangin With Old Lew as well. Sorry.
Yeah, we'll throw some links on there
so
people can find you. Cool. Well, thanks for coming out to West Oakland.
Hey, man, I really enjoyed coming.
Hope your car's still outside.
It better be. Chase somebody down. I'll just steal another car.
Yeah, it's like GTA. Cool. Okay, thanks a lot.
All right, thanks, John.